Hello everyone, my name is Laina Dawes and I will be hosting this book discussion on the exciting new book, Black Metal, Trauma, Subjectivity and Sound, Screaming in the Abyss. The book was written by Dr. Jasmine Hazel Shadrack. I'm going to refer to her now as Jasmine because we've known each other for a very long time. And before we start our discussion, Jasmine's going to be reading from a chapter from the book. And while this discussion will be centered on a specific chapter, I do want to emphasize before we begin that the reason why we're doing this is that to talk about the entire book and to do a thorough review of the book, we'd be here for several hours. This is a very dense, incredible book that just, it just leads to a lot of discussion. There's a lot of really unique concepts and perspectives in this book. So for the sake of time, we have focused on chapter 6, which is entitled Denigrata as Performance. And we find that this chapter really encapsulates some of the important theoretical concepts and ideas that Jasmine has put together in this book. So on behalf of the International Society of Metal Music Studies, I'd like to introduce Jasmine, and she will start speaking now.
Thank you ever so much, Laina. That's awesome. I also like to thank Ross Hagen and Didier Goossens for helping us get this off the ground. So this is from chapter 6. So for those of you that have got the book, it sort of starts on page 140 at the bottom of the page where it's called Denigrata, the Parallax View, because what I wanted to do was to use my theoretical framework of two feminist psychoanalysts and look at Denigrata from both of those different perspectives. So one is Judith Butler and the other is Julia Kristeva, but for today's reading, we're going to concentrate on Judith Butler. Okay, so this starts on page 142 after the vignettes at the bottom. My autoethnography focuses on woman as subject, on me as woman as subject. And whilst this does not constitute a category, it does provide a narrative of experience and representation in a field that is masculinist, which would serve to obliterate that experience. Black metal, as examined in chapters 3 and 4, is a masculinist network of signification, and women's lack of category and visibility is present by its absence. Whilst this frame questions the viability of the subject as the ultimate candidate for representation, women's representation of black metal matters. It matters because I do black metal. I perform it, I compose it, I engage with it, and it matters to me. Black metal's juridical system is visible whenever Denigrata perform live, get reviewed or interviewed. It is even more visible in the smaller performance-related minutiae. As examined in chapter 3, the second wave of black metal provides the juridical systems of power through its musical and aesthetic signifiers against which Denigrata are judged. Foucault states that juridical systems of power produce subjects they subsequently come to represent, which suggests that the second wave orthodoxy functions in parallel with the way the hegemony reproduces subjects in its own image. Those who do not perform to these standards are to be ridiculed, hated, and dismissed. I naively thought that being a musician was enough to disrupt this hegemonic production, but that's not the case. Butler states, juridical power inevitably produces what it claims merely to represent. Hence, politics must be concerned with this dual function of power, the juridical and the productive. In effect, the law produces and then conceals the notion of a subject before the law in order to invoke that discursive formation as a naturalized foundational premise that subsequently legitimates that law's own regulatory hegemony. It is not enough to inquire into how women might become more fully represented in language and politics. Feminist critique ought also to understand how the category of woman, the subject of feminism, is produced and restrained by the very structures of power through which emancipation is sought, end quote. This statement demarcates the paradox. The production capabilities of juridical power produce subjects in its own image. How one understands the category of woman within this frame will inevitably produce a dead end, as one cannot seek liberation through the same system that created the subjugation. Whilst I can argue that women's representation in black metal matters and that subjectively it is something I actively do something about, acceptance by that system is unattainable because denigrata disrupts more than it reproduces. There are two key signifiers in denigrata that represent juridical disruption: ableton instead of a drummer, and women in prominent musical and performative roles. Butler asks, do the exclusionary practices that ground feminist theory in a notion of woman as subjectively paradoxical undercut feminist goals to extend its claims to representation, end quote. But I argue that ignoring those exclusionary practices comes at a cost. For example, if we do not go to a gig consciously prepared to deal with sexist behaviour or elitist metal attitudes, but encounter them nonetheless. Of course, we are aware of the juridical nature of black metal, but it always comes as a bit of a surprise. We are then left to navigate these experiences in order to get the performance done and not waste our time. As the vignettes, as you will see illustrated on page 142, these domains of exclusion reveal the coercive and regulatory consequences of that construction, even when the construction has been elaborated for emancipatory purposes, end quote. Playing music is emancipatory. It is a liberating experience in the practice room. Once that activity is removed from an isolated, self-regulated environment and placed within the male-controlled live event roster, these domains of exclusion reveal themselves as regulatory and coercive. This can be applied to all of the vignettes. From our tech lineup, particularly because it's seen as difficult because we use a DAW, so mainly Ableton rather than a drummer. And as far as gig and organisers and sound engineers are concerned, they regulate in terms of what they're prepared to deal with. Sexist behaviour intersects the pragmatics of the live event because, as in our experience, other all-male bands were listened to by sound engineers, and we have not been. During sound checks, for example, I know for a while that I haven't been listened to, even though I'm on the mic and I'm saying, hello, could you please turn my guitar up? And, you know, I then think that we've done the gig fine. And then afterwards, I hear something back and it hasn't been exactly how I'd asked it to be. And I fully acknowledge that that's how gigs are. But I think, you know, after you've been doing it for X amount of years, you start to garner and gather a certain amount of data collection. And that's what the data collection was telling me. So I do not know whether to classify a lot of these experiences that I had at gigs negatively. They were just experiences, and, you know, we were treated so well by all the other bands we've played with, literally all of them. And the difficulties that we've found have been often online and audience-based as well. Butler states, the suggestion that feminism can seek wider representation for a subject that it itself constructs has the ironic consequence that feminist goals risk failure by refusing to take account of the constitutive powers of their own representational claims. This statement suggests that even though I had unquestioningly invested solidarity with women in our audiences, whether they were girlfriends or whatever, it didn't matter, this was not necessarily a guarantee of feminist reciprocity. Butler adds, this problem is not ameliorated through an appeal to the category of women for merely strategic purposes, for strategies always have meanings that exceed the purposes for which they are intended. By conforming to a requirement of representational politics, the feminism articulate a stable subject. Feminism thus opens itself up to charges of gross misrepresentation. Quite a damning quote, I think, that one. So, extending from this, we have then not just the aesthetics of what we present on stage, but also the musicality and the compositional frames of what we perform. And I think the two women, so Denigrata herself and Minea, and we are represented on stage differently. And I think Minea, I don't want to speak for her, obviously, but Minea's subjective experience differs from mine. And, you know, she and I have discussed this at length. Whilst the impacts of moments described in some of the vignettes in the book have been felt by the whole band, you know, the sexist minutiae were directed specifically at the women. And I think the way, because Minea is performing historically feminine roles, so that of coloratura, soprano and keyboards, so she was performing a very sort of typical femininity, even though, you know, she's got her costume on. I'm doing the man's job. Well, not me, Denigrata herself is performing in that masculine role, the historic legacy of all of it, you know, and I was really conscious of that. And just because you're a front person doesn't necessarily mean that you are the spokesperson, but it ends up kind of being that way. So extending from this, you know, is the notion of, you know, the musical roles. So for example, you know, so we know what Manea performs and it's kind of gendered feminine, and Susan McClary states, beginning with the rise of opera in the 17th century, composers worked painstakingly to develop the musical semiotics of gender, a set of conventions for constructing masculinity or femininity in music. Moreover, music does not passively reflect society. It also serves as a public forum within which various models of gender organization, along with many other aspects of social life, are asserted, adopted, contested, and negotiated, end quote. Manea's role as a soprano suggests that she carries with her in her performance and representation a gendered legacy whose specificities in historic examples demarcate the femininity of the soprano. That representation has also been characterized by madness, hysteria, and erotic mania. Effective examples of this construction can be found in Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, Mozart's The Magic Flute, Debussy's Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faune, and Monteverdi's Lamento della Ninfa. These examples, as Susan McClary states, present and represent over time the construction of femininity as other in opera. In Denigrata, Manea serves to re-encode this gender essentialism by using the representation of the witch to reclaim power, which of course is her assertion. However, in terms of how she's engaged with our live events, she is seen to perform a historically feminine role. She has not experienced the negativity that Denigrata herself has, and recognizes that my role seems to invite it. Again, this is a gendered engagement because I am fulfilling a perceived masculine role, and I feel the pressure of, you know, should I be doing this? You know, am I welcome here? What am I doing here, you might say, Laina? Whenever we play live. So this has led me to identify relationships between dominant masculinist structures that are visible through specificities of engagement. The domains of exclusion that are made more complicated because the domain that presents itself as emancipatory, so the live gig, is actually a domain of exclusion, only revealing its regulatory and coercive structure when directly engaged with by a band like Denigrata. Butler states, the identity of the feminist subject ought not to be the foundation of feminist politics. If the formation of the subject takes place within a field of power regularly buried through the assertion of that foundation, perhaps paradoxically, representation will be shown to make sense for feminism only when the subject of woman is nowhere presumed, end quote. This is why Denigrata refuses to be promoted as female-fronted. God, I hate that term. Because this categorization presumes the subject of woman, and that this representation takes place within a field that regularly seeks to bury it through the assertion of that foundation. We are emancipated through this representation only when the subject of woman is nowhere presumed, yet it is down to us as a band to ensure that happens. Otherwise, Denigrata would be known as a female-fronted band, and its matrifocal structure would be ignored. The difference between these two terms, that, you know, female fronted means female vocalist or female front woman, and the rest of the band are male. Whenever this term is used, it carries a number of assumptions. The woman is here to sell the music. She sings because she cannot play. And if she does, the music is probably bad as a result. Matrifocal, on the other hand, this is a term taken from Dr. Charmaine's Sonics, means that there is a mix of men and women in the band, and the structure of the band focuses on the women. Woman as subject in black metal and autoethnography means to focus these points of convergence by giving an account of oneself. I will now move on to the next section. Butler and autoethnography. Judith Butler's giving an account of oneself offers an important addition to my research. This is not a theoretical text, but more of an autoethnographic reading of her life and work. And this resonates with me because I can see my own performance through her theoretical positions, but also because she embraces the subjective writing position. She does not call it autoethnography, but it is a personal, honest, and open text that shares parallels with my own autoethnographic research position. Her work identifies the pitfalls, problems and hesitations in critically commenting and researching, or me-searching, one's own self as data. She states, if I try to give an account of myself, If I try to make myself recognizable and understandable, then I might begin with a narrative account of my life. But this narrative will be disoriented by what is not mine or not mine alone. And it will, to some degree, have to make myself substitutable in order to make myself recognizable. The narrative authority of the I must give way to the perspective and temporality of a set of norms that contest the singularity of my story, end quote. Butler identifies some key issues facing autoethnographic research: the problem of the meaning bearer I that I analyse, and the narrative authority that faces temporality issues, forgetfulness and gaps, and the problem of making yourself recognizable. Butler calls this the irrecoverability of the original referent that does not destroy the narrative. The telling and the retelling of a subjective narrative is often subject to change, alterations, embellishments, or omissions, depending on who the listener is, and finding effective ways to critically engage with your own subjective narrative demonstrates the necessity of autoethnographic work. Butler adds, the story of my origin I can tell is not one for which that I am then accountable, and it cannot establish my accountability. At least, let's hope not, since usually over wine, I tell it in various ways, and the accounts are not always consistent with one another, end quote. Autoethnography suggests that the accountability and alterations in my storytelling are part of a significant process. It is not biographical illusion, as Butler seems to suggest, but rather a bibliographical system of production. The self is consubstantiation with autoethnographic writing. It co-produces rather than presents a story of a person that life happens to. Montaigne states, in modelling this figure upon myself, I have had to fashion and compose myself so often to bring myself out that the model itself has to some extent grown firm and taken shape. Painting myself for others, I have painted my inward self with the colours clearer than my original ones. I have no more made my book than my book has made me. The book consubstantial with the author, concerned with my own self, an integral part of my life, end quote. This statement highlights the important idea that demonstrates that Butler's text is nearly autoethnographic, but not quite. She seems reluctant to discuss the difficulties of my storytelling, the hesitations, the gaps, the alterations in telling her story prevent a strict linear narrative that holds up under close examination. That is not what autoethnography is. Biographical cohesion ignores a person as a cultural creation, overlooking how people and their stories constantly evolve, and any illusory signifiers are just as important as verisimilitude. The multiple narrative model that Butler appears to be struggling with offers the triangulation or combination of biographical methods that ensure that performance, process, analysis, history, and structure receive fair and thorough consideration in any inquiry. It is impossible to engage with autoethnography without recognizing the issue of which self am I performing. This is something I analyse in chapter 1. Whilst the doubling of the self creates as many problems as it tries to solve, the ultimate concern of the myth of the unified autoethnographic subject is valuable to my research, and perhaps more generally. Lather suggests that the unified speaking subject with full access to her thoughts and intentions is a myth. And Butler herself notes that the gendered body is performative, which suggests that it has no ontological status apart from the various acts that constitute its reality, end quote. That through such performative markers, we understand the body as so much more inert matter, signifying nothing, or more specifically, signifying a profane void. Oh, I love that. The fallen state, deception, sin, the premonitional metaphorics of hell, and the eternal feminine, end quote. Denzin states that my story is simultaneously a personal mythology, a public story, a personal narrative, and a performance that critiques. The importance of the subjective narrative as autoethnographic data means a foregrounding of my story over the dominant discourse that favours objectivity. This seems to herald a differentiation from Butler's understanding or conceptualization of objective reality as objectively constituted. Stanley and Wise state, we have characterized approaches to women's experience as positivist and structural and evolved in adding women in. These approaches have at their heart the belief that experience is frequently wrong and not objectively true. For them, social reality can be conceptualized and researched in much the same way as physical reality can. For them, it exists as out there, as objectively constituted and discernible. From the perspective of women and women's realities, this is disastrous. This is precisely what we have been on the receiving end of for far too long. Other people or experts telling us how it is and how we should be experiencing it. If only we weren't failures or neurotics, stupid women, end quote. Whilst Butler generally makes it clear that her work is contingent on and part of a much wider conversation between theorists and theories, the objective as true writing position from this statement can be seen in Butler's writing position in Gender Trouble. In this autoethnographic text in all but name, the shift from the academic objective writing position to the autoethnographic subjective is significant. This alteration mirrors my own change in theoretical positioning, as being able to foreground my own experience as meaning something is a crucial part of feminist practice and research. It allows women to recover the irrecoverability of the original referent, and for the personal my story to gain credibility. It can be argued that Butler's giving an account of oneself shows the intrusion of the self into the role of an established gender theorist. The importance of Butler producing a text such as this lies in providing the syncretism of feminist psychoanalysis with an autoethnographic response to her position that is similar to mine. The significance of the self, recognizing the self in feminist research foregrounds the value of the subjective narrative and recalls what Stanley Wise previously noted, that experts don't help us on this particular subject. Spry states, the body in performance is blood, bone, muscle, and movement. The performing body constitutes its own interpretive presence, and it is the raw material of a critical cultural story. The performed body is a cultural text embedded in a discourse of power. This statement connects Butler's position to autoethnography and coalesces with my own research position through the meaning constructed through and on the surface of the performing body. The various acts that make up its reality of a gender performance autoethnographically offer meaning as a performative cultural text. This now takes me to the last section. This is called Performativity and Corporeality. Butler identifies that gender is performative and that gender expression is not necessarily the same as gender attribution. That performance, however constructed, is the exterior manifestation acted out on the surface of the body. In other words, it becomes represented corporeally. She states, acts, gestures, and desire produce the effect of an internal core or substance, but produce this on the surface of the body through the play of signifying absences that suggest but never reveal the organizing principle of identity as a cause. Such acts, generally construed, are performative in the sense that the essence of identity that they otherwise purport to express are fabrications manufactured and sustained through corporeal signs, and that the gendered body is performative suggests that it has no ontological status apart from the various acts which constitute its reality, end quote. I understand this not only in terms of my gender as corporeal performance, but also how I perform that gender on stage. I extend Butler's concept here to include the corporeality of a physical stage performance that is a total corporealization, which exceeds and confuses the essentialist gender binary. I am a woman who wears a costume on stage with exaggerated feminine markers such as makeup. Here, you know, obviously we're using an exaggerated form of corpse paint, and long hair, which is a feminine marker adopted by men in the metal scene as a subversive anti-hegemonic symbol. Added to this, the animalium of the antlers, as you can see on the front cover of the book, serves to exceed hegemonic constructs of femininity by aligning the gender performance with the animal representation. As discussed in chapter 1, with reference to autoethnography and black metal performance, the subjective comes the denigrata servorum, which is the blackened heart of being. Finally, there are the black metal markers such as the corpse paint and the screaming vocals, which impose a historically masculine frame onto the composite. The final confusion is represented by my function on stage as frontwoman and guitarist, in that I usurp a traditionally masculine role. The various acts that constitute my performance function as a hybrid that exceeds my ontological status as woman or as musician. As Denigrata herself, I do not consciously foreground the masculine or the feminine, yet I seem to embody a composite on stage, some of which is about presentation and some of which is about activity. My corpse paint and antlers speak to a performance of appearance and women's representation on stage, in as much as I'm not wearing a dress or makeup that enhances my features, or high heels or any of the other markers. My face is covered in messy chiaroscuro, my wig hides my real hair, and I wear big biker boots. In terms of my activity, my guitar playing occupies the majority of my movement on stage, and as I am the main vocalist, I cannot move far away from the mic. The activity, therefore, is focused directly on my hands and mouth, the perceived masculinity encoded into both of these activities, subverted by a woman performing them. These markers constitute my reality for the time that I am performing on stage with Denigrata. I acknowledge an antagonism here between Butler's statement and the importance of autoethnography. If, as suggested, the various acts that constitute reality are removed from the gendered body, then that body has no ontological status. What constitutes that reality then needs unpacking. The various acts that constitute my reality on stage when I am Denigrata herself are the performance of that construct, whereas the acts that constitute my reality as me are much more difficult to navigate. Irrespective of what role I am inhabiting at any given time, this does not remove my ontological status simply because those acts that constitute my reality change. There is a nomadic fluidity to these signifying acts that have more in common with the understanding that objective reality is subjectively manifested. Stanley and Weiss suggest, while recognizing that objective social reality exists, at the same time, ethnomethodology suggests that what is objective reality will be contextually grounded and specific. It won't be something that is objectively true for all people at all times, but is instead the result of a specific set of encounters, events, behaviors. So it recognizes that many competing objective realities coexist, and that we, all of us, have methods for producing accounts held in common between us. End quote. If objective reality cannot be objectively true for all people at all times, then Butler's understanding of what constitutes a gendered ontological reality is open to interrogation. That is not to say that an interior and organizing gender core is not present, but how that manifests itself corporeally does not necessarily mean a lack of ontological status. Given Stanley and Weiss' observation on the nature of objective reality, the accounts held in common between us can be understood through the gendered body as nomadic. It is through these accounts that ontological status is conferred. A person does not always perform their gender corporeally as a constant, but this does not remove their ontological status or mean they are performing a fantasy. Butler acknowledges that reality can be fabricated as an interior essence. That very interiority is an effect and function of a decidedly public and social discourse. The public regulation of fantasy through surface politics of the body, the gender border control that differentiates inner from outer, and so institutes the integrity of the subject, end quote. I argue that this position does not take into account the significance of the subjective narrative foregrounded by autoethnography. For example, my performance as Denigrata herself can be understood as a type of quasi-drag performance, but not because I'm dressing up as a man. I wear a wig and stage makeup that can be understood as female, so me, to male, which is the music, guitar and vocals, to female again, which is Denigrata herself. But my gender invites another layer of subversion. I acknowledge that this would not constitute drag in to most people, but they perhaps would not understand the way that I feel as Denigrata herself. The wig enhances feminine signifiers, so long, voluminous hair, and the stage makeup demarcates the black metal aesthetic markers. And I perform a masculine role on stage because I am filling a traditionally masculine role as guitarist and vocalist. These acts, whilst I'm on stage, constitute my reality for that moment as a gendered hybrid or compound that I understand as Butlerian fantasy. My interiorities and my exteriorities finding for that one moment on stage the integrity of the subject. Instead of a public regulation of that fantasy through surface politics of the body, my gender border control that differentiates inner from outer institutes the integrity of my subjectivity. I feel at one with my performing body. For me, at that moment, That is my subjective reality. And as examined earlier in this chapter, this creates the importance and value of my autoethnographic performative text. As discussed in chapter 1, this is the doubling of the self, and this recognition that prevents the various acts that constitute my reality remaining fixed and static. Everything is fluid, everything is in constant motion. This doubling is a layered practice that uses my existing body as a foundation to build Denigrata herself upon, and arguably, my body presents some fixed gender issues. I identify as a cis woman in my everyday life, and it is upon my identification that my stage performance is constructed. Denigrata herself presents a complex gender composite that is, I feel, more of a unifying subject than a discrete or exclusionary one. Denigrata herself's ontological status is nomadic, moving between the various acts that constitute reality of the gender binary and the fabrications manufactured and sustained through corporeal signs in order to create a unifying subject. When I am Denigrata herself, I do not feel that I am either male or female. I am both and I am neither. Yeah, the binary coexists within the matrifocal frame, so the fabrications are themselves sustained through the various acts of my corporeal signs. This functions as a binary, even though the process I go through is tripartite, which is female to male, back to female again. As such, I'm crossing the borders from one culturally constructed gender performance to another. And beyond that, woman is a performance in the first instance. So the layers of gender performativity are multiplicitous. My autoethnographic subjectivity means that while some of what Butler states is true, the nomadic nature of my subjective reality means that what constitutes my gender performativity changes. Butler states that drag fully subverts the distinctions between inner and outer psychic spaces and effectively mocks both to express a model of gender and the notion of a true gender. I find that through my onstage performance, my psychic interiorities become my exteriorities because I put so much into the screaming and the guitar work. However, this is not done to subvert any distinctions, nor is it done to mock the expressive model of gender. I do it more to present a unified and signifying subject. Denigrata herself as a liminal gendered performer invites negative reactions because the construct exceeds and complicates the essentialist gender binary by those at Denigrata's live events. The dual function of guitarist and frontwoman is important because I feel if I was just the vocalist or just the guitarist, as I have been before for a very long time, the gendered response is actually less complicated. I have been a metal guitarist for the last 15 years, and I have never had such a complicated interactions with people at gigs as I do now. It is as if putting the two traditionally masculine roles, the guitars and the vocals, into one woman, however constructed, is too much. Reassured by my bandmates that I have continued to behave professionally, this leads me to think, therefore, that just like my cure in chapter 5, Denigrata herself can be seen as being disliked, not because of poor performance, but because of the role that she inhabits. The musical performance is well crafted, in time and well executed. Denigrata rehearse every single week and are always prepared for live events. You have to be if you are playing against Ableton instead of a drummer. The performative corporeality then is the nexus point. Denigrata herself's corporeal performativity as a unifying gendered subject disrupts gendered expectations and creates a disorganization and a disaggregation that disrupts the regulatory fiction of heterosexual coherence and the essentialist essentialist binary of gender construction. I extend Butler's definition of corporeality to identify with the avant-garde composer Harry Partch and his use of the term. According to Navid Balgrazan, he conceptualized corporeality as an art form where music joins dance, acting, voice, gymnastics, staging, lighting, and the sculptural beauty of the musical instruments to depict the essence of the drama, end quote. The physicality of Partch's position coalesces with Butler's use of the term to mean physical performance and creative transcendence. She suggests that to consider gender, for instance, as a corporeal style, as an act, as it were, which is both intentional and performative, where performative suggests a dramatic and contingent construction of meaning. This connects with Partch's definition through body performance as a significant site for the construction of meaning that can occur on the surface of the body. Denigrata herself represents the conjoining of these two definitions and the applications of corporeal performativity, not only in terms of gender performance, but the musical and corporeal representation of that gendered performance and how it must become an art form on stage. For me, that art has created a theatre of catharsis. As is my open quote, performed text is a lived experience. The performance doubles back on the experiences previously represented in the writer's text. It then represents those experiences as an embodied performance. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. That was wonderful. So these next discussion questions will actually center on pulling out some of the elements that Jasmine has just discussed in that section of the chapter that she has just read. So I'd like to start off with, let me see here. Well, basically, just to start off with this discussion is like, what was your journey that led up to writing this monograph? And most importantly, because as I mentioned to you before, with a lot of my British friends, that when you say monograph, I'm always like, what? What is that? Because from a North American standpoint, we don't use that word. So can you tell us what the difference between writing a book and writing a monograph is?
Sure, I think certainly to UK and Europe, there's if you say book, that could be anything. I mean, that could be a novel, it could be, so if you say monograph, it's the single author of an academic text.
Right.
So we tend to refer to that as a monograph rather than book, because people are, they would be able to necessarily discern what you mean by that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
My journey of how I got here, I started playing the guitar. I'm self-taught in 2000, so the journey started there. So 21 years ago, and that's a lot of data. I mean, when I first started this comes from my PhD, and when I first started my PhD, I was actually doing ethnography because I was interested in other women's experience, and I'm going through some of the data that I collected, and I'm like, but this has all happened to me too. So where do I fit my voice in with this pre-existent knowledge? And a lot of people were already writing about this, and I thought, okay, there's got to be another way around this. And then I discovered there's lots of different sorts of autoethnography, but I discovered one particularly called interpretive performance autoethnography, and it blew my mind. And I was like, right, this is my jam, son. I know where I am with this. This is fantastic. And that just meant that I just didn't stop writing. But I mean, I don't think I ever really thought it was going to become a monograph. I just thought it was going to be a PhD, and the only people that were going to see it would be my supervisors. So, I spent all of last year working with an absolutely incredible editor, Jess Farr-Cox, to make sure that it was then, it wasn't just for an academic audience, it was for a wider readership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's yeah, I was thinking about the positionality because as I'm studying to be an ethnomusicologist, I'm using ethnography in my work. However, as when I was writing my book, which is more autoethnography to a bit, not as not as it's very surface level in comparison to your book. I found that writing from a perspective of a Black woman in heavy metal, that I was feeling both insecure about my positionality because there's just not a lot of Black women in heavy metal. But I also felt that providing my narrative and my experience was important because of the voice of the voiceless. So we are used to, as women, we are used to not either, as you mentioned in terms of the vignettes, there are experiences that we expect that our identification as a woman or will help us in our relationships with other women, but sometimes they do not.
Oh, it's a kicker. It's a real kicker. I wish that wasn't a thing.
Yeah, so it is important. It was a very difficult, it was a challenge in order to balance the, yes, I can do this and my voice is important, versus dealing with kind of the insecurities of how the outside world
Oh, it's
perceives
terrifying.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely understand what you're saying, and that's exactly how I felt too. You're writing this stuff down, and you're like, well, I think when I was doing the PhD, I got a certain sense of comfort out of the fact of thinking, well, it's only going to be my supervisors that are going to read this, so that's fine. I can write what I want,
Mhm.
with regards to my own experiences. But when it came to making it into a monograph, and I was like, oh, suddenly, the demographic is hugely different now, and I am now making myself extremely vulnerable all
Right.
over it. And so I absolutely get what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, you did, in terms of, you had just mentioned in terms of working with an editor after you finished your PhD to translate your dissertation into a
Mm-hmm.
general readership
Mm-hmm.
book. And so I was wondering, because there are parts that are very theoretical, yet your personal accounts open up the book to a non-scholarly audience. How challenging was it to merge the autoethnography into such rich and sometimes challenging scholarship?
That is an excellent question. Do you know, it's funny, isn't it? With all of our academic training, we get taught this right from undergrad level. Don't use personal pronouns in your academic writing.
Right.
And by the time we get to PhD level, you are really locked into that kind of, those guidelines. So when I discovered autoethnography, it's like it took all of my academic training and threw it in the bin, because all of a sudden I there's a theoretical framework that allows me to use the first person pronoun. Oh my god. And it really freaked me out for a while. I was like, right, I've got to, do a bit of practice here. I've got to get to grips with how I want to use this.
Mm-hmm.
How do I want to be seen? How do I want to get across? How is this going to affect the information that I want to impart to people? And the moment you start using I in your sentences, the whole world swings around you and it changes. And I found that harder than the academic theoretical stuff. I'm used to that. I'm very comfortable there. Theory acts as a buffer zone between me and the world.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. I just get my teeth. It's probably my autism. I just absolutely get my teeth into it and I love it. But talking openly about trauma, no, that was horrible. But I also knew that the book wouldn't be what it is without it.
Right.
And for my own catharsis and my own healing, I had to get it out of my head. And the only way to do that was to write it down. Therapy doesn't, I mean, I'm sure it has helped other people, but it didn't help me.
Hmm.
Writing and metal helped me.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's, um, I guess, in this chapter, um, it's kind of, to me, there's two parts. And in the introduction to the chapter, you mentioned that you've written it in two parts. The first, as you write, is centered on your band, Denigrata, in terms of how the band's philosophy, how it is placed, and perhaps displaced within the general audience, within what the general audience generally thinks about black metal. And that's what I really actually liked about it, because you've decontextualized what us metal heads or people that listen to black metal think about what black metal really is.
Mhm.
um and the you also kind of deconstruct, and I'm going to say this from a very North American point of view, is what we hear, what general, us general people, when we're online and we hear about black metal, there's a certain salaciousness um, around the cultural aspects of black metal that's coming out of the UK and Europe.
Mhm.
And then you also there's certain people within the black metal scene that have sparked their own rumors and gossip. And, we hear the stories about Mayhem and Euronymous and all that. And that's all we know.
Mhm.
And so I really kind of appreciated that section of kind of deconstructing and making us think more about the genre and the culture. So the second part of this chapter, you go into a close analysis of the inners and outer workings of your band, which you've discussed in your
Mhm.
reading. which I really personally found brilliant. And it opened me up to thinking about the various possibilities within extreme metal as a whole, which I had never considered before, and is very beneficial to my own dissertation. Thank you very much. So, to give more insight to our audience, I want to ask you a few questions that synthesize some of the longer passages in the chapter. And I've also pulled out a few sections that I'm hoping you can elaborate on. So, before
Okay.
we start that, I want to talk about the background of how you incorporated the construction of Denigrata's music and how it plays such a pivotal role in this book. And you have slightly already answered my question, but you did say, when you were writing and performing with the band, were you working on your were you thinking about this new type of autoethnography as you were writing music with your band,
Hmm.
or in your dissertation process, did you think about the work that you had already done with Denigrata and layered that in when you were writing your dissertation? So, what came first, the chicken or the egg?
That's a very good question. Oh God, I don't know. I mean, this is the funny thing, right? I mean, I've been playing guitar for 21 years, and initially, when I first started my PhD, I was doing the wrong PhD, and I can remember having a meeting with my director of studies, and she went, "Do you really want to do this, Jazz?" I was like, "No, not really." And she's like, "Right, we need to go away and have a really good think about what you're doing." I was doing a completely different subject area, so I went away for a bit. And I had a really hard think to myself, and I was like, oh my God, it's been staring me in the face. What are you doing? Why are you not doing this on metal? And I was like, and the penny dropped. And then I just cranked out all the words I needed for my PhD, and it was done really quickly. So when it finally dawned on me that that's actually what I needed to do, in my mind, I just like, why are you doing something else on metal? I mean, you've been doing this for so long. I mean, do you really want to do this as well? And ultimately, yeah, I did. So that's, when I was rehearsing with Denigrata, I was just locked into going through the songs and making sure everything was right, and everything was being played right. At gigs, though, I did have my autoethnography brain switched on, but not at rehearsals, weirdly.
Okay.
Which is interesting. I think it's because when it was rehearsals, it was just the band. We're just in a sweaty practice room every Sunday, and it was just us 5 people. When we're at a gig, entirely different, because suddenly you are in a public space. Things that you can't possibly really anticipate what the response is going to be. And we had some people that were just real like hardcore fans, and they were genuinely lovely and so supportive. But as is often the way with extreme metal bands, particularly, that's not always going to be the response you get.
Yeah. How, as a graduate student, one thing that I find very challenging is, in the chapter that we're focused on today, there's a lot of technical, like, I was just like, how did she do this in terms of writing about the nuances of the music, the tonality, where the band decides to ebb and flow, when the band decides to break? I mean, you've added such, and I was like, obviously you're reading music, but like, what is it about your background that goes into, I wish everybody was sitting here with a book, with your book in their hands, so we could slowly go over it piece by piece, because I found as a writer, the sections when you're talking about even the Abletron, which we'll talk about in a second, and even just like between, and we'll also talk about blast beats and burst beats. And I found them so nuanced in your writing. I just thought, where is she coming from? Like, did you take classes on, because I think that we know that there's metal artists. Some of them do read and write music, and a lot of people don't. They're learning as they go along, or they're constantly collaborating with their band members. So so you're saying that it was quite easy for you to kind of go back, like, think about the work that you've done and just write, pump it out, because you're obviously passionate about not only your work and your research, but also the music itself.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, do you know what I think it is? And I was only diagnosed when I was 43. I'm 44 now, so it's not been that long really. But I think it's because I'm autistic, and I have this ability with music that I perhaps don't have with other human beings.
Mm.
I find that the comfort and the joy that I have when I engage with metal, whether I'm just doing some close reading or some close listening with it, whether I'm writing new riffs, when I'm around other metalheads, it's just the most organic, gorgeous thing. And that's when I'm at my happiest. Metal makes me happy. And, you know, all of this stuff with the PMRC in the 80s, oh, you know, metal makes you evil, all the rest of that crap. It's like, no, you have so completely misunderstood this. So I wrote about it in the way that I did because I was writing it. I was composing it.
Right.
Because I was in the music with the other people in the band. We knew all of our parts inside out. We knew what the textures were. I know what the settings are on my guitar head. So I knew then how to directly translate that from music to words for the book.
Okay.
Which is probably why it's as nuanced as it is. You got to know it inside out before you can write about it.
Yeah. Well, it must have been, it seems like the collective of five, which makes up Denigrata, seems to have been such a unique connection, in terms that, you know, you all were on the same level, not just musically, but also kind of intuitively, emotionally. What would you call it? Like there was definitely a connection there. Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Do you know, was it because we were all feminists? Was it because we all had similar frames of our musical tastes? You know, we loved Schoenberg and Mozart as equally as we loved Walls in the Throne Room and Dark Throne. We weren't elitist about it. If it's gorgeous and fantastic and gives us that buzz, then, you know, that's what we need. And I have this absolute preoccupation, and it probably comes from playing death metal for a long time, but I absolutely adore the guitar interplay when it comes to counterpoint. So you've got these two independent guitar lines, but they're working harmoniously together, harmonically together, and that makes me so fucking happy. It's just the most beautiful thing. And even if you're shifting through semitones and back to a kind of tonal engagement, it's just, that to me is the equivalent of divinity. You feel like, you know, you're just this kind of vessel and the music's just passing through you. It's the most extraordinary experience. And I don't really think anything else can come close to that.
Okay. Well,
sorry, I don't know if I answered your question then.
No, you did. No, you definitely did, and thank you. But in order to kind of position some other questions I have for you, I wanted to play a track. We've kind of we're not playing the entire track of Kyrie Ellison. Did I pronounce that properly?
Kyrie Eleison.
Oh wow, I really butchered that up. Okay. Y'all got what I meant. Yeah. But there are some elements that you talk about in the book that I see obviously in this music video, and so I wanted to play. But actually, while I'm setting up, can you explain to viewers kind of how did this particular song come about? What were your ideas writing the song?
I'm a bit obsessed, or very obsessed, with requiem masses, because they are the sonic representation of the thin veil between life and death. You know, they are masses for the dead. And whether it comes from the Mozart, which is obviously stunning, or the Sanson, which is a bit later but equally as beautiful, I wanted us to write a requiem, but as Niall Scott calls it, make it apophatic liturgy. So you're passing it through the lens of black metal, and it becomes blackened as the result, and it becomes an affront to God. So all the words that I am screaming are from the original Requiem Mass, and it's all in Latin.
Oh wow!
Screaming in Latin is a That's a hell of a thing. So
Yeah.
you're screaming this dead language, and it is the most incredible experience. So the Kyrie eleison is the second movement from a Requiem Mass. All the 7 songs on the album mirror a Requiem Mass structure, and so the Kyrie eleison is the second movement.
Okay. Well, let's listen to. I'm just going to share my screen, everyone, and we'll listen to a segment.
It's just dropped out.
Yes. Oh. Okay. Let me stop share, and I just I'm back. Jasmine, I just so love this track.
It means those wonderful people.
Yeah. And there's just there's so many things going on in that section that but one thing I just want before I go on, there was one thing that you had mentioned in your reading about your positionality in relation to Manea, who is the soprano. And I realized you were kind of positioning Denigrata in this image as like kind of taking on the masculine, and this is through a number of elements. Obviously, your vocal performance, the aesthetic to a lesser extent, but in terms of your positionality as the principal, not only in the band but in this particular video, it kind of Monea comes in as the feminine, and that is through obviously her vocal performance, which you mentioned is commonly perceived or traditionally seen as feminine, and obviously her own aesthetic. But I was when I first saw this video a number of years ago when it first came out, and I also was thinking that between you and Manea, I'm sorry, lady. I'm sorry, but you know, there's a sexuality. I was trying to. There was something about one of the images in this video that spoke to me, and that was when you were in the field and when you were coming out of the water. I see your legs,
Mhm,
and your legs kind of defy your upper body. There's a sense
mhm,
of vulnerability, but also maybe even a sexual subversiveness in just seeing you, your body, but so showing your upper legs. And in relation to the soprano, who, you know, the elegant gowns, and obviously when she's in the water, you know, she's also, you can see a bit of her legs too, but there's a duality in terms of sexuality between these two
mhm.
performers. Was that something that you thought about, or am I just kind of a
Oh,
weirdo?
you are absolutely right. But
Okay.
that only occurred to us after we saw the final edit of the video, where we're like, oh. So I think, and I still think, because she and I are still working together for a new project called Delore, she is all the beauty in the world, and I am all the darkness.
Mm,
And I think because we are very much that kind of yin and yang together, that the way that I've described it, you know, she is, you know, an angel in the true biblical sense, terrifying, covered in eyes, and she will annihilate you. That's her. Whereas I'm this kind of chaos demon that brings all of the other stuff. So I'm of the earth and she's of the air. That's kind of the way that we've only genuinely occurred to us after we saw the final edits of the video. And I should just quickly explain who the big hairy man is at the beginning of that
oh
clip.
yes, yes, yes. Sorry, yes, definitely.
Because we are from Northamptonshire in the centre of England. That is Alan Moore, the graphic novel writer, general awesome human being, wizard, you know. And we asked him if he wanted to be in the video with his gorgeous occult self, and he said yes. And we were absolutely blown away by the fact, and so we were very, very proud to have him in our video. So that's
Mm-hmm.
who he is, in case anyone was wondering.
Thank you.
But I think he was really significant because he openly calls himself a wizard, and you know, he's the research that he's done on Northampton and Northamptonshire about all of the esotericism here, really connected with the occult signifiers that were shown in the video. So if you watch the video from the beginning, there are some very, very clear visual signifiers and mise en scène that show you that this is, because it connects so wholeheartedly with black metal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the things that you mention quite often in the book is the difference between the Hyperborean mode and the transcendental mode
Yeah.
within the music of Denigrata. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the differences represented in this video in terms of, I think I got it myself, but
Mm.
you're the expert. So between the Hyperborean and the transessential and kind
Yeah.
of the visuals there.
These terms are taken from the awesome Hunter Hunt Hendricks and her work in Hideous Gnosis and the book Mors Mystica. There's a very, like, sonically, there's a very clear differentiation between the second wave of black metal and the stuff that's coming out now.
Mm-hmm.
So if you listen to Mayhem, Darkthrone, you know, 1990s era, you have this very tightly controlled sonic space and compositional structure, and it's something that I have called the basso continuo nero, and this is a term that I've borrowed from Baroque composition, where you have these particular musical staples of the cello and the harpsichord. If you know that you've got those two instruments together, then you know that this is a piece of Baroque composition. And
Mm-hmm.
in metal, if you've got tremolo guitar picking and blast beats, that you know that that's going to be black metal. So I kind of borrowed that term and put nero on the end, because obviously it's an Italian term, and it means, so the whole idea is that it's become blackened because it is black metal composition. And those things, the basso continuo nero, are the things that really characterize the 1990s, even early 2000s compositional and sonic structures of the second wave, all the Hyperborean. By the time you get to kind of the 2000s up to sort of now, things started to breathe more. And you know, whilst you have these blast beats, either whether they're foot led or snare led blast beats, it's a really abrasive sound. And actually, as Hunter Hunt Hendricks quite rightly says, after a while, if the whole song is blast beats all the way through, your ear gets really used to it and it starts to kind of fade out. The brutality of it starts to become too comfortable. So you then think, well, what can we do then? So what the transcendental, the more contemporary third wave stuff of black metal does is it breaks that tension and it drops the beat. So you'll have blast beats for a while, and they're often quite washy blast beats, often like bass drum led blast beats, and then will suddenly the snare will drop to a half time, and it feels like all that tension has just gone oof, and it's just blown up and expanded, like it's suddenly taken a huge breath. So it's the point of ejaculation, let's say. You've got all that tension and all of a sudden there's your money shot.
Right. I wouldn't know that. I wouldn't know that at all. I'm a virgin.
It's suddenly, it's that moment where all the tension is suddenly released and a new form takes root. And it's really, I think one of the best examples of that is Black Cascade, Ex Cathedra by Wars in the Throne Room. We have this gorgeous washy blast beats, and it goes to this burst beat, and it just feels like the riffs suddenly open and bloom, and it's the most extraordinary, gorgeous thing. And you know, the riff in that song is so fucking beautiful. Damn, I wish I'd written that. It's just so gorgeous, and the production is just it's gorgeous. So what I think we were quite conscious that we kind of felt like upstarts in the black metal community, and we wanted to be able to pay homage to what had gone on before whilst doing something new at the same time, and the use of Ableton instead of a drummer. You know, there's a number of reasons why we chose that. Like, extreme metal drummers in the UK are few and far between, and if you're lucky enough to find one, they're already in like 10 bands. So it's really difficult to get anything done. So we thought, well, we want to get on, so what can we do? So let's turn to a DAW instead. And we were able to create drum tracks instead, but the difficulty of that is live. Now, whilst you can launch Ableton live from a launch pad, it does mean that you're basically playing to click live. So if you can't hear everything properly through your monitors, oh my God, it can be a mess. Luckily, we didn't ever get into that situation, and it makes you a much tighter live performer. Much tighter. Yeah, you can't risk it.
Yeah, well, I guess, and it's like the clip that we just saw, you can hear and see the transition between the blast beats and the burst beats. And that transition, as you were telling me before, even the tempo, you know, slowly moves out. And that to me was one of my favorite kind of sections of the track, is that, you know, and so thank you for the answer to that question, because you know, you've really explained to me, like, you know, what am I hearing? And I love it, but there's a narrative underneath that transition that I knew was way more kind of
all that tension's got to go somewhere, right? You know, I mean, if you're constantly listening to blasts, and the joy of the blasts can wear off after a while and they lose their impact, and we didn't want that. So when the blasts are there, you know, it makes your ears just go, oh God, that's great. And then similarly, when the burst beat happens and the beat drops and you suddenly do get that explosion of tension, it gives you a different sense of relief and a different sense of letting go. It's keeping hold and letting go. Blast beats are keeping hold and burst beats are letting go.
Yeah, and I guess metaphorically, it feels like the sun is opening.
Yeah.
At that moment, the sky is opening, and you can see the sun in that.
That's exactly how Hunt Hendricks talks about it. You know, the blast beats are cold and not of the moon, and burst beats are warm and of the sun.
Now, do you think that there is I was thinking about, there was a documentary called One Man Metal that came out by, I think it was a Vice thing that came out 5 or 6 years ago, where they interviewed 3 musicians who basically wrote all of the, you know, they played all of the instruments on their on their albums.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if you had ever encountered people questioning you because of the drum programming. Now, you have really
Ah.
done an amazing job at kind of explaining, not only kind of the musical differences in your book, but a lot of the aesthetics and the theory that made this decision, the decision that the band made in
Mm.
terms of, you know, this, using Ableton.
Mhm.
But I was wondering if, and maybe this is a North American thing, but if we are too obsessed with kind of the foundational or traditional root modes of black metal, and we're not willing, when new kind of
Mhm.
technology comes in,
Mhm.
to make those.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's not just a North American thing. That is, and that's also something that I have adhered to myself previously.
Hmm.
Because I think there's this and I don't think that's specific to black metal. That's just there's a wider context here, and that's all of metal. Uh, More so previously, perhaps than now. I think things are starting to kind of open up a little bit, but there's this idea that if you're using any kind of electronics, then you're electronic music. You're not a band, and there's
Right.
something to do with legitimacy and authenticity, as a thorny a term as that is. And I think if you're seen, particularly in extreme metal, as you're not using a drummer, you've got this real primacy, this real focal point of performed masculinity is an extreme metal drummer.
Mm.
What they do is fucking hard, right? So watching extreme metal drummer perform is mesmerizing.
Yes, it
They're
is.
going, the beats per minute is just crazy, and the consistency of the strength that they actually have to put into those blast beats whilst they're double bass drumming at the same time is amazing.
Hmm.
So suddenly they're looking at the stage and they're looking for the drummer, and there isn't one. There's somebody there with a kit setup that you would see at an electronic gig. So you can there's suddenly this a crossover that people are uncomfortable with or didn't like. And you know what? Before then, I probably would have thought the same thing until I heard the results. And I was like, so suddenly there's more things we can do. I mean, number one, you're not dragging around a drum kit everywhere with you, which is quite nice.
Yeah.
And also your drum kit's always going to sound the same because you don't have to tune it because the venue's too hot or whatever. Your kit's always going to sound the same because it's programmed. There's a lot of benefits, but after we did that first album, we did actually use the drummer, but then obviously my health deteriorated, and we had to stop.
Mhm. Well, now in terms of the visual aesthetics, and this is something that for viewers and for readers of the book, you might, you do go into great detail about the aesthetics. And one of the things that I was interested in is how you can represent your own personal experiences and your not even personal experiences, but who you are as a person through the visuals. And we saw the visuals in the video in terms of the horns and also your take on corpse paint, where you've kind of reinverted it.
Mm.
And you do talk a lot about kind of, why, like where these decisions came from and how what they represent not only, I believe, like in the music, but also in just in terms of your research. Um, um,
I, Sorry.
well, I would just say, like in this particular chapter, you have a series of vignettes that center around your experiences that demonstrate not only the sexism that exists, and I'm not going to go too much into this because you've already, the portion that you read really goes into this, but I was just kind of thinking about like the, can you kind of summarize some of the decisions you made in terms of your aesthetics? You've
Sure.
talked about kind of the feminine of the hair. So you're wearing, in performance, you wore a wig that was
Mhm.
more billowing and boisterous, which kind of nodded to femininity. But then there's other things about your aesthetic that you've chosen to kind of show the masculinity, or not even the masculinity, but even power.
Mm.
It just, to me, it represents power. So I was wondering if you could discuss that a little bit more.
Sure. Um, all of the decisions, well, for me personally, all of the decisions that I made, whether it was how my corpse paint was going to look, what I was going to wear on stage, you know, wig, antlers, everything, was even the name of the album and the structure of the album, the fact that it was going to be a requiem, all of it is trauma informed. So all of it has come from the fact that I am a survivor of domestic abuse, and the fact that I kind of survived that. You know, I lived in a very liminal space there for a while, where you exist in this space between life and death. And I needed to do something with that concept. And I think that's why I was so drawn to Requiem Masses. And I just thought, right, well, we have an opportunity here to really do something extraordinary with it, and to do a black metal version of one of these. I mean, not only, you know, because I have a Catholic upbringing and I consider myself a recovering Catholic, but you know, that stuff never really leaves you, does it? And so it was just speaking to so much of the me that went before, the different versions of me in survival mode. And I needed to be able to kind of retake that power, as you say. So if the idea of power comes across to you, then that's great. So I did manage, but you know, I didn't really consciously do it. How I felt on stage with my kit on and my guitar on, you know, screaming 7 bells of shit down the microphone was the most incredible thing. And that was the healing process. That was the catharsis. Because as Kathy Acker says, every scream is a howl of pain. And I had the opportunity to take all of that shit from inside and get it out. And if I could do so in a safe musical environment like I did with Denigrata, then so much the better. Because if someone was to ask me face to face about what I went through, I kind of go non-verbal, don't really want to talk about it, find it very difficult. I mean, I wrote about it in the book, but I didn't really want to talk about it for this reading. So the fact that it then took on this musical form was great, because I didn't actually need to explain it. The music did that for me.
Yeah. I pulled a sentence that I loved from the chapter, and you just say, it's very simple: I can be far more dangerous and affect change in the role of a musician. Yeah, and I love that. Yeah.
You got your antlers on, and you know, so you've already got a very clear marker that I am something, you know, I'm already othered. So I'm going to just push that concept of being othered as far as I can. You know, you've got this huge, you know, wig on that makes you look really wild. And that was exactly it, like wild, untamable, uncontrollable, untouchable. So that's why in the video and on stage, you can only ever see my legs. You don't see anything else. I wear an outfit that goes right up to here and right down to my, I mean, it's hot, but, you know, right down to my wrists, because nothing on my hands though, because it gets in the way of the guitar. But because I wasn't prepared to be interpolated into any kind of gaze at all. So, you know, boobs on display, shoulders, whatever. No, I'm taking control of that. And even the name Denigrata herself means to abase herself. And I thought, well, if I call myself that, it stops any fucker else from doing it, right? That was my thinking.
Now you briefly mentioned before in terms of disability, and you mentioned how your autism has been beneficial in terms of, you know, not only writing music, but just kind of conceptualizing and the transference of your knowledge into something, you know, concrete, which is the music itself. And in kind of the section of your book, and I might butcher this, peroration, dying words as abdominal lifeblood, you
Abominable.
Abominable
Yeah,
lifeblood.
but other than that, perfect. Yeah.
Sorry. You do talk about disability in black metal, so I'm wondering if you can briefly elaborate on that.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I had to stop playing in Denigrata because I got really ill, and I received a diagnosis of CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's a repeated events rather than a singular event that caused the trauma. And then the physical manifestation of that was fibromyalgia, which is a chronic illness. And in fact, I think I'll give a list of bullet points of all the different things that I go through with fibro. the fatigue is definitely, I can handle the pain. It's muscle pain. But unfortunately, it did mean that screaming, because I get it really bad in my sternum, my collarbones, and my shoulders, which meant suddenly screaming, you know, and it's all coming from your diaphragm up through your sternum and out. And then my guitar, and I play a BC Rich Warlock 1987 class act series, which are neck heavy, you know, even though I've got a decent guitar strap, all the weight's on my shoulders, and I realized that I didn't have the physicality anymore. So as soon as I got sick, I had to say to the band, I'm so sorry, I can't do this anymore. I'm too ill, and I don't know what the future is going to hold for me. I'm not able-bodied. I don't have the ability to do this. And bless their hearts, they made the decision that they didn't want to carry on without me. So Autoethnography stopped, and it was pretty heartbreaking for everybody, really. And I knew that I was the cause of that, I guess, and that was horrible. But similarly, I was enormously grateful for the experience at all, and I love them all dearly. But I was then confronted by everything was different. You know, I was suddenly a disabled person, and the month after I got my CPTSD and fibromyalgia diagnosis, I then got my neurodivergent diagnosis of being autistic with ADHD, and I was like, oh. But I was happy to get that diagnosis, because I then went, oh my fucking God, that's what it is. Right, okay. And so, you know, being 43, very, very late diagnosed, was great. I was so happy to know. So then I realized, like, so this is where I get my music skills from. Like, this is how I can hear entire orchestras in my head. I can work stuff out on the pen and the guitar, seeing the keyboard and fretboard in my head. It doesn't mean that my brain never, ever shuts up. It's just music all the time. Like, literally, it never stops. Drives me insane. So, I mean, that's a downside. But I think that's why extreme metal, death metal, black metal particularly, have given me so much, because it keeps my brain happy and it keeps my emotions happy, because the turmoil that I'm feeling inside is able to achieve a balance by what I'm hearing externally around me. So whilst I was very happy with that diagnosis, I have been less happy about the other one, and it's meant that my life suddenly got very, very small. It can be quite isolating having a chronic illness, but I knew that Autoethnography herself had a kind of life beyond Autoethnography. So I then thought about, well, what can we do with her? Like, what else can she do? And I realized that I wanted a photographic series. So what I did was I married up my occulture with Autoethnography herself, and then in peroration we were able to construct this kind of photographic series where it didn't really take much out of me, because I was sitting still. So it was fine with regards to my chronic illness, but we were still able to create, we were still able to, you know, paint pictures. It's just the pictures were a bit different.
Yeah. Now, so what are you doing now? I mean, I know that you're very busy now, but like, in some ways, will this monograph lead to another book? Like, what are your plans in terms of your research, your writing, your music?
I mean, it might. I don't know at the moment. I mean, you know, it's only been out 6 months, so I'd quite like to leave it a little bit before I get stuck into anything else, to be honest. But myself and the woman who performed as Manea in Autoethnography, she and I are working together now on a kind of, I don't even know what you call it. It's kind of pulling on the esotericism of British folk, but it's passing it through a black metal lens. Blackened folk, is that a thing? That anyway. And it's we've nearly finished an album, and we know we've done all this through lockdown, which has been quite difficult, and it's very hard practicing any vocals, because obviously there's a time lag, so it's quite difficult, but all the music and the lyrics and everything are written, so that's really exciting. So that would be the main musical focus, and I'm halfway through composing my own requiem mass that is kind of I want to say neoclassical. So, but I haven't finished that yet. That's going to be a little while. That's quite a long process, that one. But they're the things that you know, that I'm able to hyper focus on. and I just dive straight in. I've been working on my website that's been up and running since last August, and that has become this kind of repository for all of my academic work, all of my paintings, poetry, music, the lot basically, photography.
That's great. And yeah, and just kind of on a nerdy note, like in terms of photography, what is your kit like? Like, what are you using to?
Oh no,
Um,
I don't have it.
uh,
I have a wonderful friend, and her business is called Candy Photography, and she's local to me. And it's like she already knows what I want, so I don't actually have to overly explain stuff to her, which is great. So she's kind of in charge of the of the visuals on that front. And I'm hoping to do another series soon. I'm currently working on a new painting series as well. I've nearly finished my first, and they're quite large canvases, so that's good
good,
fun too. But
great.
I mean, all of them all of it has the black metal aesthetic. It's like Elodie Lesourd says in the first Helveta journal, Journal of Black Metal Theory, that black metal exceeds its boundaries. So you can look at a photograph, or you can read some lyrics or a poem, and you're like, oh, that kind of feels black metal. It's because it has such a gorgeous aesthetic value to it, and that's kind of where I am with it.
Mm-hmm.
That's most of the art that I'm involved with now has that kind of aesthetic value.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you for this
Thank you so
conversation.
much.
Thank you for this was amazing, and thank you very much. And thank you to all of the viewers out there. Again, and a great thank you to the International Society of Metal Music Studies. I appreciate that. And we will have all the information about where you can find the monograph. I know that you mentioned that Amazon is selling the book like crazy.
They are at the moment, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll have all the information about where you can purchase the book if you have not purchased this yet, and all the contact details as to where you can contact Jasmine if you have any additional questions um, for her or any comments on her amazing work. So thank you very much, Jasmine.
Thank you so much, Laina. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Great, thank you.